23 degrees. Appalachian wind slicing through the valley like a straight razor. And Celeste Whitfield, 27 years old, was freezing to death on a red dirt road at the edge of Blackthorn Hollow, West Virginia. She was wearing a soaking wet housekeeping uniform, thin as paper, her feet shoved into cracked plastic slippers, her face bruised purple, her lips split and turning blue, and her body had stopped shivering, the deadly biological red flag that her organs were beginning to shut down. She'd run nearly 2 miles through the darkness without looking back, because if Sheriff Dale Mercer found her, he wouldn't take her to a hospital. He'd drag her straight back to the basement she'd just risked her life crawling out of. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and Celeste collapsed against the white wooden fence of a massive hilltop ranch, the one place in Blackthorn Hollow that locals only dared mention in whispers. The smell of dry hay, the warmth of horses, and a pool of golden light spilling from a half-open stable door. She crawled toward it. Inside, standing beside a jet-black Arabian horse, was a man 6'2", broad-shouldered, black hair slicked back, a clean-cut short beard, and steel-gray eyes that turned to lock onto her. This was Cormac Ashford, 33 years old, the owner of the ranch on the hill, the most powerful man within 100 miles, and the one name that cops, politicians, and the toughest men in Appalachia all knew better than to cross. Celeste looked up into the ice-cold face of the man this whole town called the Devil, and she said the only words she had left in her. "Can I sleep in your stable? I'll stay in the far corner. I won't touch anything. Please just let me stay till morning." Cormac Ashford lowered his flashlight, looked at the bruises on her face, looked at the cracked slippers on the frozen ground, and made a decision that would wake up an entire town, tear apart a criminal operation, rip the badge off a corrupt sheriff, and force a man who'd never bowed to anyone to face the one line he couldn't uncross. If this story kept you till the very last second, hit that like button so we can keep telling stories like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss the next chapter. Cormac Ashford looked at the girl curled at his feet for exactly 3 more seconds. 3 seconds, no more. That was all the time he needed to read the entire story written across her body. The purple bruise around her left eye wasn't from a fall. The thin housekeeping uniform with the faded Geary's Lodge logo printed over the left side of her chest had been washed too many times, and the torn plastic slippers on the frozen ground were something no one in this world would willingly wear outside in the middle of a 23-degree snowstorm, unless they had no other choice left. Cormac turned off the flashlight, slid it into his back pocket, and said exactly 4 words in a voice that allowed no negotiation. "Get up. Come inside." Celeste blinked, thinking she had heard him wrong. She had prepared herself to be chased away, yelled at, even dragged back out to the gate. She hadn't prepared herself for this. "I only need the stable," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I won't go into the house. I don't want to cause trouble." Cormac didn't repeat himself. He never repeated himself. He only looked down at her with steel-gray eyes, and in that stare there was something that wasn't pity, wasn't tenderness, but absolute command, the kind of command the most dangerous men in the Appalachian region had learned never to argue with. "The stable isn't a place for humans," Cormac said, his voice lower now but heavier. "Get up." He pulled the radio from his belt, pressed the button without taking his eyes off her. "Hollis, come down to the stable. Bring Knuckles." Then he bent down, took hold of Celeste's arm, and pulled her to her feet. His hand was so large it wrapped around her entire upper arm, and Celeste could feel the terrifying strength in that grip, the kind of strength that could break her bones without effort. Yet he held her so gently, she almost cried just because of that. Less than 3 minutes later, 2 figures appeared from the side door of the main house on the hill. The first was Hollis Crane, Cormac's consigliere, a tall, thin man with salt and pepper hair, a face as sharp as a paper knife, and a long scar running from his temple down to his left jawbone, the mark of a life no one at any dinner table would want to ask about. Hollis didn't say a word when he saw Celeste. He only looked at Cormac, received a short nod, then turned and opened the door to the main house. The second was Josiah Brandt, nicknamed Knuckles, Cormac's closest enforcer. Knuckles stood 6'4", with a neck as thick as a bull's, shoulders broad as a door, and hands always covered in black leather gloves that hid his scarred fingers. Knuckles looked at Celeste for exactly 1 second, then stepped forward, took the heavy wool coat off his own shoulders, and wrapped it around her without saying half a word. The coat was so large it swallowed Celeste's thin body inside it. They brought her into the main house. The warmth from the fireplace struck Celeste's face like a slap in reverse, so strong it made her dizzy and nearly brought her to her knees again. Knuckles caught her with one hand, led her to the chair beside the long oak kitchen table, then disappeared through the back door and returned with a woman around 40. Brown hair pinned neatly back, eyes warm but quick, already holding a first aid kit and a folded set of dry clothes. This was Nettie Brandt, Knuckles' wife, a nurse who had practiced for 15 years before coming to live on the farm. Nettie didn't ask Celeste a single question. She only knelt, gently removed the torn plastic slippers from the girl's blue and purple feet, checked her toes for signs of frostbite damage, then used a warm towel to wipe her face, avoiding the bruise. "You need to change into dry clothes," Nettie said, her voice calm and professional but kind. "After that, we'll get you something to eat." Celeste sat there in the warm kitchen of the house all of Blackthorn Hollow feared, wearing the wool coat of a Mafia enforcer, being cared for by a nurse, beneath the cold and unblinking gaze of Cormac Ashford, the man standing with his back against the kitchen doorway, arms folded across his chest, silently watching her as if he were reading a sentence only he could see. Nettie came back from the kitchen in less than 10 minutes, carrying a small wooden tray that she set in front of Celeste, a steaming bowl of hot oatmeal, 2 slices of buttered toast, and a cup of warm water mixed with honey. It wasn't a feast, but to a woman who had survived 8 months on leftovers and tap water in a basement, that tray of food looked like something from another world, a world Celeste had forgotten she had once lived in. Celeste reached for the spoon, but her fingers were shaking so badly that the metal clinked against the side of the bowl. Nettie sat down beside her and gently placed a hand on Celeste's wrist, stopping her. "Slowly, sweetheart," Nettie said, not in the voice of someone giving an order, but in the voice of someone who had seen too many starved bodies not to know what would happen next. "Your stomach has been shrinking for a long time. If you eat too fast, you'll throw it all back up, and we'll have to start over. 1 spoonful at a time. Chew carefully. Swallow slowly. No one is going to take your food from you. No one is going to take your food from you." Those 6 words struck Celeste harder than any slap Randall Geary had ever landed across her face, because for the past 8 months, food had always been taken away. Food was a weapon. Food was a reward when she worked the full 16 hours, and a punishment when she didn't meet the quota. Geary locked the refrigerator with a chain, and the key was always in the pocket of his cheap suit jacket, right beside the phone he used to call Mercer whenever anyone dared set foot outside the door. Celeste scooped up the first spoonful of oatmeal, lifted it to her mouth, and swallowed. The warmth slid down her throat, into her empty stomach, spreading through her body like a small stream running across cracked earth. And then Celeste cried, not with sobs, not with wails, just tears slipping quietly down her bruised cheeks and falling into the bowl of oatmeal while she still held the spoon in her hand and didn't let go. She wasn't crying because it hurt. She was crying because for 8 months, no one in this world had given her anything warm without demanding something back. And now, a woman she had never met was sitting beside her, telling her no one would take her food, in the kitchen of a man the whole town called the Devil. Knuckles stood by the door, his back against the wooden frame, his black leather gloved hands folded across his chest. When Celeste began to cry, the enormous enforcer said nothing and didn't move. He only turned his face away, looking out into the black window, his jaw clenched tight. There are things even a man used to violence doesn't want to see, and a 27-year-old woman crying over a spoonful of oatmeal is one of them. Hollis sat in the corner of the room, back straight, one leg crossed over the other, a small leather notebook open on his lap. He wrote quietly with an ink pen, not looking up, but the hand holding the pen stopped the moment Celeste cried, hovering in the air for an instant before continuing to write. Hollis was the man who remembered everything. That was his job, and tonight he was remembering every detail. Cormac didn't sit beside Celeste. He pulled a wooden chair from the head of the long table, placed it across from her at about an arm's length, and sat down. He said nothing the entire time Celeste ate. He didn't rush her, didn't question her, didn't show impatience. He only sat there, both hands resting on his thighs, gray eyes following every spoonful she brought to her mouth with the cold patience of a man used to waiting, because in Cormac Ashford's world, the most important decisions were never made in haste. Celeste finished the bowl of oatmeal, the 2 slices of toast, and drank the cup of honey water to the last drop. She set the spoon down on the table, wiped her eyes on the sleeve of Knuckles' oversized wool coat, and lifted her head. For the first time since she had crawled into the stable, her eyes met Cormac's directly, without dropping. And Cormac knew she was ready. He leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice low, calm, and allowing no evasion at all. "Now tell me, who did this to your face?" Celeste didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, her thin fingers laced together on the oak tabletop, and in that silence, the crackling of the fireplace was the only sound in the kitchen. Then she began to tell him. Not because she trusted Cormac Ashford, but because she was so exhausted she no longer had the strength to keep any secret inside her. "My father died when I was 8, Celeste said, her voice hoarse but steady. "A mining accident in McDowell County. Cave-in. It took them 4 days to bring his body out. My mother never got a cent of compensation because the mining company went bankrupt before the papers could be signed." She stopped, swallowed, then continued. Her mother, a woman 5'1" and weighing less than 110 pounds, had raised her daughter alone by working 2 jobs, cashiering at a grocery store during the day and mopping floors at the county hospital at night. 9 straight years. Until the same hospital whose floors she cleaned every night became the place where she stayed. Late-stage lung cancer, the doctor saying she had 6 months left, though her body only endured 11. Celeste dropped out of high school during her final year and moved back home to care for her mother. 11 months of changing bedsheets, 11 months of mixing pain medication, 11 months of sitting beside the bed, listening to her mother's breathing grow weaker and weaker, until one March morning, when Celeste was 20 years old, the room fell completely silent. She buried her mother on a rainy day in the county cemetery, standing alone before the grave because there was no one else left in the world to stand beside her. And the week after the funeral, the bills began to arrive. $87,000 in hospital debt. Celeste sold the little house, sold the car, sold the furniture, and still paid off less than a third. 20 years old, no degree, no family, not a dollar in her account, and a debt larger than anything she could imagine pressing down on her back every morning when she woke. Hollis stopped writing. He looked up for the first time since Celeste had begun speaking, his sharp eyes beneath salt and pepper brows resting on her face, reading every crease on the forehead of a 27-year-old woman who looked as if she had lived through 40 years. Celeste kept going. She worked every job she could find. Waitress at a roadside diner, night shift dishwasher, stockroom helper at a supermarket, anywhere that paid cash by the day. She moved from town to town, sleeping on acquaintances' sofas, sometimes sleeping on buses, dragging that debt behind her like a shadow that never went away. Until one April afternoon, when she was sitting in a laundromat in a small town across the state line, waiting for the only load of clothes she owned to finish spinning in the dryer, she looked up and saw it. A colored flyer taped to the glass door, with bold letters that read, "Geary's Lodge, Blackthorn Hollow, West Virginia. Hiring housekeeping staff. Room and board included. Monthly wages paid on time. Contact now." Celeste read that flyer 3 times. Room and board included. Monthly wages paid on time. Those 8 words sounded like the only exit left on the map of her life. She called the phone number on the flyer that very afternoon. A thick, hearty male voice answered, asked her a few simple questions, then told her she could start the following week, that she only needed to bring her identification papers and they would take care of the rest. That voice belonged to Randall Geary. Celeste packed a backpack and put inside everything she owned in the world. 2 sets of clothes, a toothbrush, the laminated photo of her mother tucked in her wallet, and $62 in cash. She caught the last Greyhound bus of the day, sat in the very back row, rested her head against the icy window, and watched the Appalachian forests swallow the sunset outside. 7 hours later, she stepped off at the Blackthorn Hollow stop. Randall Geary was already waiting in the parking lot, obese, red-faced, wearing a cheap suit, reeking of cologne, with a smile so wide it showed all his yellowed teeth. He shook her hand, carried her backpack for her, opened the car door for her, and drove her to Geary's Lodge, a 3-story motel beside the highway, sunk in the fog at the foot of the mountains. Celeste walked through the front door of the lodge at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and that door slammed shut behind her. Celeste stopped there. She looked at Cormac, her gray-blue eyes wet and blurred but not lowered. "That was the last time I walked out of that door by my own will," she said, her voice shaking, though every word was clear. "Until tonight." On Celeste's first morning at Geary's Lodge, She was called into the manager's office on the second floor. Randall Geary sat behind a pressed wood desk covered in papers, his swollen belly pushed tight against the edge, the buttons of his cheap suit straining, the smell of cheap cologne so thick Celeste had to hold her breath. He was still smiling, the same wide smile from the night before, still fixed on his shiny red face, but his eyes were different. His eyes weren't smiling. "Just procedure, sweetheart," Geary said, spreading one fat hand in front of her. "Give me your identification, driver's license, social security card. We need to keep them on file for human resources." Celeste handed everything over. She didn't think anything of it, because every job she had ever worked before had asked for paperwork. Geary shoved it all into a desk drawer, locked it, slipped the key into his suit pocket, then pushed a printed sheet covered in tiny letters across the desk. "Sign here. Standard employment contract." Celeste signed without reading. It was the biggest mistake of her life, but she wouldn't know that until 3 days later, when she asked Geary about her first month's wages. Geary leaned back in his chair, laced his hands behind his neck, and read each deduction aloud in a flat voice, like he was reading a menu. Room deposit, $400. Uniform fee, $150. Food, $300. Facility use fee, $200. Insurance provided by the lodge, $150. After all deductions, her take-home pay, not a cent. And because she had signed a contract committing to work a minimum of 12 months, if she left before the term ended, she would owe Geary the full deposit plus a breach of contract penalty, totaling more than $2,000. Celeste looked at the paper she had signed, looked at the locked drawer holding her identification, then looked up at Geary's face. The smile was gone. "Now, go down to the basement and get your room," Geary said. "Your shift starts at 5 o'clock in the morning." The basement of Geary's lodge wasn't employee housing. It was a low-ceilinged concrete space, with no windows, fluorescent lights blazing white 24 hours a day, 7 thin mattresses spread across the floor, and a refrigerator locked with a chain that only Geary had the key to. The women were already there when Celeste walked down the stairs. They looked at her with eyes she would never forget. Not curious eyes, not welcoming eyes, but the eyes of people who already knew how the story ended, and no longer had the strength to warn anyone. 16 hours a day. Cleaning rooms, washing bedsheets, scrubbing floors, cooking for guests, doing laundry, carrying things, and anything else Geary pointed at and told them to do. No days off. No phone. No contact with the outside world. If anyone asked why they weren't allowed to leave, Geary would remind them of the contract, the debt, and if that wasn't enough, he would pick up the phone and call Sheriff Dale Mercer. "Mercer will be here in 15 minutes, Geary often said, calm as if he were ordering pizza. "And he'll arrest you for stealing my property. A state charge, 6 months to 2 years. You want to try me?" No one tried. Celeste stopped, drew a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice changed. It wasn't even any more. It trembled, but it trembled from anger, not fear. 2 weeks ago, Geary brought in a new girl. Her name was Jolene, 22 years old. Her eyes, Celeste said, looking down at the table. Her eyes looked exactly like mine on the first day I walked down into that basement, so terrified she couldn't even cry. Jolene didn't know the rules, didn't know the schedule, didn't know the refrigerator was forbidden territory. Celeste began hiding leftover food from the kitchen for Jolene, slipping it into the pocket of her uniform and bringing it down to the basement after each shift. It worked for 5 days. On the 6th day, Geary checked the hallway camera and saw Celeste tucking a container of leftovers into her shirt. He called her into the office, closed the door, and without saying a word, slapped her so hard she fell to the floor. Celeste hit her shoulder against the wall, slid down, and Geary stood over her, his face flushed red, his index finger pointed at her face. "Next time, I'll lock both of you in the cold storage room for 3 days, Geary snarled, his voice hissing through his teeth. "Who do you think you are? You're nothing. You have no papers, no money, no one. You only exist because I allow you to exist." Celeste lay on the office floor, her cheek burning, her shoulder throbbing, and there was only one thought in her mind. Not how to escape, but if I escape, I have to find someone to save Jolene. That night, I waited for Geary to lock the basement door and go upstairs, Celeste said, looking straight into Cormac's eyes. I climbed through the ventilation window behind the kitchen, crawled through the fence, and ran. I didn't know where I was running. I just ran uphill, against the wind, until I fell against your fence. Celeste stopped speaking. The kitchen was so quiet they could hear the wind outside striking the glass doors. Knuckles was no longer looking away. He was staring straight at Celeste, both black leather-gloved fists clenched at his sides, his jaw grinding so hard the tendons in his neck stood out. Hollis closed the leather notebook, gently, precisely, like closing the lid of a coffin. Cormac hadn't said a word through the entire story. He had sat motionless, both hands resting on his thighs, gray eyes never leaving Celeste's face for even a second. But now he stood, slowly, the wooden chair scraped back across the floor with a small rasp. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out into the darkness at the foot of the hill, where somewhere in the snow, Randall Geary's 3-story lodge lay still like a hibernating beast. Cormac turned the silver ring, engraved with his family crest on his ring finger, a habit Hollis knew well, one that only appeared when his boss had made a decision, and that decision would make someone pay very dearly. Geary, Cormac said, his voice low, slow, and so cold the fire in the hearth seemed to drop by one breath. That name dared to keep people captive right at the foot of my hill. Cormac hadn't even turned back from the window when it came. Alternating red and blue light swept across the farm's white wooden fence, cutting through the snow, sliding over the kitchen ceiling like ghostly fingers feeling along every wall. Then the loudspeaker tore through the late-night silence, booming from the main gate about 200 meters from the house, distorted and full of authority. "Ashford, this is Sheriff Mercer. Open the gate. Right now." Celeste froze in the chair, not from cold. This time she froze because of something far worse than cold. She recognized that voice instantly, that hoarse voice thick with chewing tobacco, the voice she had heard at least 5 times in the past 8 months, whenever a woman from the basement tried to run and was dragged back before dawn. The cup of tea in her hand fell onto the table, water spilling across the oak surface. But she didn't see it, didn't hear it, didn't feel anything except her heart pounding inside her chest, like a trapped bird throwing itself against iron bars. "He'll take me back," Celeste whispered, her voice breaking apart, her eyes wide as she stared toward the kitchen door as if Mercer might burst in at any second. "Mercer always takes us back. Always. He gets $500 each time from Geary. Every time. He never misses. Please, please let me run. I'll go out the back door. I'll... sit down." Cormac's voice wasn't louder than a hair compared with the way he had spoken to her before, but it cut through Celeste's panic like a blade cutting rope. He didn't turn to look at her. He still stood beside the security monitor mounted near the intercom, his gray eyes fixed on the live camera feed of the front fence, where the red and blue lights spun on top of the patrol car. "No one is taking you anywhere. Sit down." The loudspeaker roared again. "Ashford, I know you can hear me. I'm looking for a runaway employee suspected of grand theft from Geary's lodge. Open the gate, or I'll treat this as harboring a criminal and call for backup." Cormac walked to the intercom panel mounted on the wall beside the kitchen door, pressed the button, and spoke in a voice so calm it was almost bored. The voice of a man who had faced far more frightening things than a county sheriff many times in his life, and wasn't impressed at all. "Mercer, this is private Ashford family land. You don't have a search warrant, you don't have an arrest warrant, and you don't have any jurisdiction on this property. Turn your car around before the ice sends you sliding into a ditch." Silence stretched for 4 seconds from the other side of the intercom. Then Mercer's voice came back, no longer through the loudspeaker but through the radio unit mounted at the gate, closer, angrier, and Celeste could picture his face outside with painful clarity. 55 years old, skin darkly weathered from 30 years standing out on roads, gray-streaked hair flattened beneath the brim of his sheriff's hat, beer belly sagging over a leather belt, jaw working constantly around chewing tobacco, and the small eyes of a man who had sold his soul long ago but still believed he was doing right. "Don't play this game with me, Ashford. I know the girl is in there. She's stolen property. I'm carrying out lawful duty. If you don't open this gate in 2 minutes, I'll break the lock and call for support." Cormac lifted his finger from the intercom button, cut the connection, and turned to Hollis. He didn't need to say anything. Hollis was already standing, his leather notebook tucked into the inner pocket of his suit jacket as he crossed into the next room and opened his laptop. Knuckles moved to the front door, silent as a walking boulder, checked the lock, and stood blocking the main entrance, both hands resting at his sides, ready for anything that crossed that threshold. Cormac pulled his phone from his back pocket, tapped a number he knew by heart, and lifted it to his ear. The phone rang twice. Uncle Perry. Cormac spoke, his voice low, even, without a single ripple. Wake up. Call Ashworth. Call all the brothers. We've got an uninvited guest at the gate, and a name called Geary needs to be taught the rules again. The other end of the line was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then Perry Ashford's voice came through, 60 years old, slightly rough with age but sharp as a blade that had never gone dull. How many minutes? 40, Cormac answered. 30, Perry said, and hung up. Cormac put the phone back into his pocket and stepped beside Celeste. She was sitting rigidly in the chair, both arms wrapped around herself inside Knuckles' oversized wool coat, eyes fixed on the kitchen door, her whole body trembling not from cold but from memory. Cormac didn't touch her, didn't hug her, didn't pat her shoulder. He only stood beside her, each word clear. In 30 minutes, Mercer will understand he knocked on the wrong door, and Geary will begin to understand that he imprisoned the wrong people at the foot of the wrong hill. Outside, the sound of Mercer's baton striking the iron gate echoed through the falling snow, steady, violent, arrogant. He didn't know that every blow against that gate wasn't breaking into a farm. It was starting a machine that, once running, no one in this world could shut off, not even him. Mercer called for backup 10 minutes after Cormac cut off the intercom. 2 more patrol cars came tearing through the snow, red and blue lights spinning wildly but no sirens on, because in the dead of night in rural Appalachia, sirens only woke people and created more witnesses, the last thing Mercer ever wanted when he was doing work for Geary. 2 deputies stepped out, 2 decades younger than Mercer, baby-faced, shoulders hunched inside their patrol jackets, eyes heavy with sleep, but not daring to ask why they had been called out at 3 o'clock in the morning to the gate of the Ashford farm, a name anyone in uniform in this county knew to stay far away from. 3 patrol cars lined up across the iron gate. 6 red and blue lights spun in circles, washing over the white wooden fence and the snow-covered branches like some strange stage in the middle of a winter night. Mercer got out of his car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a crowbar nearly 3 feet long, heavy in his hand. He spat a wad of chewing tobacco into the snow, tightened his grip around the crowbar, and walked toward the lock on the iron gate. The 2 deputies stood behind him, hands resting near their weapon belts, but neither of them moved forward. They stood there because rank forced them to stand there, but their eyes kept flicking toward the main house on top of the hill, where yellow light still glowed behind the glass windows, and inside that light, they knew there were men even federal agents thought twice about before knocking on the door. Mercer raised the crowbar, set the pointed end into the gap around the gate lock, and then he stopped, not because he had changed his mind, because the soles of his boots were vibrating. It started lightly, so lightly Mercer thought he was imagining it, a low tremor spreading through the frozen red dirt road, traveling up through the rubber soles of his standard patrol boots, and running along his shin bones. Then it grew stronger, steady, like the heartbeat of the ground waking up. Then came the sound, not sirens, not gunfire, but a low, unified roar rolling down from the northern hill road, echoing between 2 snow-covered ridges and multiplying 10 times over. Engines, many engines. Mercer lowered the crowbar and turned to look up the slope. And he saw headlights. Not 1 pair, not 2 pairs. Dozens of pairs of headlights cut through the falling snow like the eyes of predators opening in the dark, stretching into a long line along the crest of the hill, slow, steady, solemn, pouring down the red dirt road that led straight toward the farm gate. 15 black SUVs appeared one after another in the crossing beams of light, their bodies dusted with snow, windows tinted dark, engines growling together in a steel chorus. They didn't line up, they spread out, like water filling a mold, like a hand closing. 3 vehicles curving left, 3 pressing right, the rest cutting across the rear, and in less than 1 minute, Sheriff Dale Mercer's 3 patrol cars were sealed in as if caught inside a closed fist. No way out, no gap. Then all the engines shut off at once. The silence that rushed in after the roar wasn't quiet. It was something alive, heavy, pressing down on Mercer's chest like an invisible block of concrete. Falling snow was the only sound left, whispering, light, fragile, so delicate it only made the silence more terrifying. The vehicle doors opened at the same time. 15 SUVs, 30 doors, swinging out in one rhythm, as if they had rehearsed it 100 times. Men stepped down into the snow, black suits, long wool coats, polished leather shoes moving over ice without slipping, faces cold as carved stone in the night. No one said a word. No one needed to. They only stood there, arms folded across their chests, eyes fixed on Mercer, and in the red and blue light from his own patrol cars, Mercer saw the thing he had spent 30 years as a county sheriff trying not to see. There was a power in Blackthorn Hollow far greater than the badge on his chest, and that power had just woken up. The crowbar in Mercer's hand suddenly weighed 10 times more. He looked toward his 2 deputies. Both had shrunk back inside their patrol cars, doors locked tight, eyes wide behind the windshields, and neither one of them had any intention of opening a door and stepping out. The door of the lead SUV opened last, while all the other men had already stepped down into the snow and stood motionless like black statues in the white night. This door opened slowly, deliberately, as if the person inside wanted Mercer to wait, to look, to feel the full weight of the moment before facing whatever was about to step out. Perry Ashford set his left foot down into the snow first, then his right, then rose to his full height, with the unhurried calm of a 60-year-old man who had no need to rush because the whole world would wait for him. His white silver hair was combed neatly back, not a strand out of place, his face bony but sharp, his black wool coat falling past his knees, and in his right hand was the carved silver cane that anyone in Blackthorn Hollow over 40 recognized at once, because that cane had appeared in every important decision this town had made for 3 decades. From negotiations no one dared name, to nights people only retold in whispers after every door had been locked. Perry walked over the snow without slipping, the silver tip of his cane striking the ice in rhythm with each step, the sound of metal meeting ground clean and sharp in the frozen air. He passed the line of men in black suits without looking at any of them, without nodding, without giving a signal, because his presence was already in order. He stopped exactly 3 steps from Mercer. Not 2, not 4, 3 steps. Close enough for Mercer to see every wrinkle on his face, far enough that Perry didn't have to smell the chewing tobacco in the sheriff's jaw. Mercer stood rooted in place, the crowbar still in his hand but lowered to his hip, his arm stiff. He recognized Perry Ashford instantly. Of course he recognized him. Everyone in this county did. But recognition and readiness to face him were 2 entirely different things. "Dale," Perry said, his voice gentle, warm, almost friendly, as if the 2 of them had happened to meet at a coffee shop on a Sunday morning, not in the middle of a snowstorm at 3:30 in the morning, with 30 men dressed in black surrounding 3 police cars. "I remember when your father was still alive. He stood at this gate too. But he stood here asking for work, Dale. Not trying to break a lock. Times really have changed." That sentence hit Mercer harder than any punch. Because it was true. Mercer's father, an unemployed miner, had come to the Ashford farm 30 years earlier asking for a stable cleaning job, and Perry Ashford had given him work, paid him decently, and fed his family for 7 years, until the man died of cirrhosis. Mercer knew that. Perry knew, Mercer knew, and now 30 men knew it too. Perry took 1 more step forward, leaving only 2 steps between them, his voice dropping lower, each word sharp as a razor. "We know about Geary, Dale. We know about the $500 each time you drag people back for him. We know all of it, every single time." As if receiving an invisible signal, all the men around them pulled phones from their coat pockets at once. 30 phones rose at the same time. 30 flashes lit up. 30 camera lenses pointed straight at Mercer's face, turning him into the center of a stage he had never wanted to stand on. Hollis Crane stepped out from behind Perry, the leather notebook tucked into the pocket of his coat, a phone in his hand, his voice cold as steel cutting through the air. "Sheriff Mercer, everything happening here is being recorded live and transmitted to Attorney Franklin Ashworth, who is sitting at his computer in his office with a hotline connected directly to the FBI field office in Charleston. Any action you take from this second forward will become federal evidence. Would you like to continue?" Mercer looked around. A sea of black coats. Camera light. Expressionless faces. The crowbar in his hand suddenly became the stupidest thing in the world, a useless bar of iron surrounded by 30 phones recording every drop of sweat on his forehead, even though the temperature was 23 degrees. Dale Mercer was a bully. He bullied undocumented girls in a basement, bullied young deputies who didn't dare question orders, bullied the whole town with the badge on his chest and the gun on his belt. But bullies have one fatal weakness that never changes. They only function when they are the strongest person in the room. And tonight, standing before Perry Ashford, 30 men and 30 cameras streaming live to the FBI, Dale Mercer wasn't the strongest. He wasn't even the second strongest. The crowbar fell into the snow with a dull, heavy thud. Mercer turned away without saying a word and walked quickly back to his patrol car, his hands shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to open the door. The engine started, the tires spun wildly on the ice, flinging dirty snow to both sides, and the patrol car shot into the darkness at the end of the hill road like a dog with its tail tucked. The 2 deputies' patrol cars followed immediately after, even faster than their boss's car, as if they had been waiting for that moment from the very first minute. The red and blue lights went dark. Darkness and snow swallowed everything. The sound of the engines faded farther, then disappeared. Inside the property, Knuckles hit the switch to open the iron gate, stepping out to give Perry a respectful nod. The old man walked through, his cane tapping softly on the snow-covered stone path, brushing the snowflakes from the shoulders of his coat with one thin, age-spotted hand. As Perry headed toward the main house, he passed the kitchen window and stopped for 1 second, looking in. Through the fogged glass, he saw Celeste standing beside the fireplace, the oversized wool coat still draped over her shoulders, her gray-blue eyes red from crying but no longer shaking. And in those eyes, Perry saw something he had seen many times in his life. Not gratitude, but the stunned silence of a human being who had just realized the world was not entirely as cruel as she had believed. The black convoy left as quietly as it had come, 1 vehicle at a time, headlights off, engines growling softly, before dissolving into the darkness at the end of the hill road. Within 10 minutes, the Ashford farm returned to its ancient silence, with only the sound of wind slipping through the cracks in the doors and snow touching the stone roof. Perry sat in the living room talking with Cormac and Hollis for about 15 minutes, his voice low and even. Then he stood, leaned on his cane, nodded to his nephew, and walked out to his private car. Before getting in, he turned back and said exactly 1 sentence. "Tomorrow morning we'll talk properly. Tonight let the girl sleep." But the girl couldn't sleep. Nettie led Celeste up to the guest room on the 2nd floor, a small, clean room with a single bed, thick blankets, and an electric heater. Under the light, she treated the wounds on Celeste's face more carefully. The bruise around her left eye showed no sign of an orbital fracture, but it was badly swollen and would need alternating cold compresses for at least 3 days. The small cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding, though Nettie still covered it carefully with an adhesive bandage, and her feet, blue and purple from frostbite, had begun turning pink again thanks to the warmth, but needed to be watched through the night. Nettie gave her 2 pain pills, a cup of warm water, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and told her, "Go to sleep. This door doesn't lock. No one is locking you in." Those 6 words again. No one is locking you in. Celeste lay in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the old house creak around her, and she couldn't close her eyes. Not because she was afraid. The fear had begun to drain away from the moment she saw Mercer flee from the kitchen window. She couldn't sleep for a simpler and more painful reason. She had grown so used to sleeping in fear that when safety appeared, her body didn't know what to do with it. She lay there for 20 minutes, then got up, pulled on the sweater Nettie had left on the back of the chair, and stepped into the hallway. She walked to the window at the end of the 2nd floor corridor, the one that looked down toward the stable below, and sat on the windowsill. The stable was still lit, its warm yellow light spilling across the snow, and Celeste looked at it the way someone looks at a dream they are afraid will vanish when morning comes. She didn't hear Cormac's footsteps. He appeared at the end of the hallway as if he had already been there, or as if this house were part of his own body, and he knew exactly who was awake, who was walking, who was sitting by a window at 4 o'clock in the morning. He didn't ask why she wasn't sleeping. He only walked over, holding 2 cups of hot tea, placed one on the windowsill beside her, then pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the hallway and sat down across from her. Steam rose from the 2 cups of tea between them, thin and warm in the cold air of the old corridor. Silence stretched out. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind of silence 2 strangers share when both are carrying things too heavy to speak aloud, but too close to pretend they don't exist. Then Cormac spoke, not because Celeste asked, but because darkness has its own way of making people open their mouths, especially men who have kept theirs closed for too long. "My mother's name was Eileen," Cormac said, gray eyes fixed on the stable below, his voice low and even, as if he were telling the story more to himself than to Celeste. "An Irish immigrant. She came to America at 19, knew no one, had nothing but 1 suitcase, and a thick County Cork accent. She met my father at a horse auction in Charleston, and he brought her back to this farm. Cormac paused and took a sip of tea. My father built everything you see here, Celeste. The farm, the business, the family. He was a powerful man. But power doesn't make a man kind. He treated my mother like decoration in her own house. She wasn't allowed to go out alone, wasn't allowed to call Ireland, wasn't allowed to have an opinion at the dinner table. Celeste looked at Cormac, and for the first time, she saw something behind the steel in his gray eyes. Not weakness, but an old wound that had healed into a scar and still ached when the weather changed. She died when I was 12, Cormac said. Officially, it was an accident. A fall down the stairs. But I was the only 12-year-old child in this house, and I knew my mother didn't fall down the stairs, Celeste. She died of despair. Despair kills more slowly than sickness, but more surely. He set the teacup down and looked straight at her. I'm not a good man, Celeste. I do things the church will never forgive, but there is one line I never cross. Never. And the name Geary is standing on the wrong side of that line. Silence returned. Outside the window, the snow was falling more slowly now, more lightly, as if the storm was growing tired too. Celeste held the teacup in both hands, warmth soaking into her palms, and asked the question she had wanted to ask from the moment he had pulled her to her feet in the stable. Why did you save me? Cormac didn't turn to look at her. He looked out toward the stable, where the yellow light still spilled across the snow and the black Arabian stood motionless behind the half-open wooden door, and he spoke in a voice Celeste would remember for the rest of her life. Because you came into my stable on your knees, and that reminded me that there are things in this world money can't buy and shouldn't sell. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the first light of the second day pierced the thin curtain of snow outside the window of the oak-paneled study, the room where the Ashford family had made every important decision for 3 generations. The long oak table seated 8, its dark surface polished smooth by the oils of hands over decades of use, while framed land maps hung on the walls around it, and a large black and white photograph showed the man who had founded the family standing beside a horse, his face hard as stone, his eyes fixed straight into the camera with a stare Cormac had inherited almost exactly. Cormac sat at the head of the table, his black shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, a cup of unsweetened black coffee in front of him but untouched. Hollis sat on his right, the leather notebook already open, an ink pen lying across the page. Knuckles sat on his left, both leather-gloved hands resting on the tabletop, back straight, broad shoulders taking up almost the entire wooden chair. Perry sat beside the fireplace in an old leather armchair, his cane leaning against the armrest, legs crossed, eyes half closed, though Cormac knew his uncle didn't miss a single word. On the table, a laptop was open, its screen showing Franklin Ashworth's face through a video call. 50 years old, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit, gold-rimmed glasses, his hair parted neatly down the middle without one strand out of place. Seated in his law office in Charleston with wooden bookshelves behind him, his voice soft, but every word he spoke carrying the weight of a court ruling. Cormac laid out the situation in 12 sentences, not one extra word. A woman named Celeste Whitfield, 27 years old, had crawled into the stable last night after escaping from Geary's lodge, where she had been held for 8 months with 6 other women, forced into labor, her papers confiscated. Sheriff Mercer paid to drag escapees back, and Mercer had come to the farm gate last night and been pushed back. He stopped. The room was silent. Then Knuckles spoke. The enforcer rarely opened his mouth in meetings, because his job wasn't to speak but to act. So when he did speak, everyone in the room turned to look. "Give me 5 men," Knuckles said, his voice deep, even, carrying no emotion except absolute practicality. "Tonight. 15 minutes and it's done. Geary will never open his mouth to give anyone an order again." The room went silent again. Hollis didn't look up. Perry didn't open his eyes. Ashworth on the screen pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and waited. Everyone looked at Cormac. Cormac didn't answer right away. He looked down at the oak tabletop, the fingers of his right hand tapping lightly against the wood, slow and steady, like the sound of a clock counting down. And in that quiet, everyone in the room knew he was truly weighing it. This wasn't the moment when he played at being a good man. This was the moment Cormac Ashford, the man who had built an empire on foundations the church would never forgive, stood between 2 roads, both of them familiar. Then he lifted his head, his gray eyes fixed on Knuckles, and spoke in the voice of a man who had chosen. "If I send men to beat Geary, 3 days later, he comes back and punishes those girls twice as hard. He'll move them somewhere else, destroy the papers, and we'll never find them again. I don't want Geary afraid, Josiah. I want him gone, not from town, from society. And the only way a man like Geary disappears for good is federal prison. Knuckles nodded, one short nod, accepting without needing further explanation, and leaned back in his chair. Cormac turned toward the screen. Ashworth, what do you have for me? Franklin Ashworth took off his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, then put them back on, a habit he performed whenever he was about to say something important. The FBI has had an open investigation file on Geary for 6 months, Cormac. An anonymous source reported forced labor activity at his chain of lodges in southern West Virginia. The problem is they're missing a living witness. No one has escaped, and no one inside has been able to contact the outside. The investigation stalled because there wasn't enough evidence to request a federal search warrant. Ashworth looked straight into the camera. Celeste Whitfield is the final piece. If she agrees to give an official statement, and if we can provide more physical evidence from inside, photographs, video, anything at all, I can put this file on a federal judge's desk within 1 week. Evidence from inside, Hollis repeated, speaking for the first time, his voice cold and precise. Meaning we need someone still inside that basement. Cormac nodded. Whether Celeste can reach anyone is the next thing we need to solve. He turned to Hollis. Hollis, you and Ashworth handle the rest. Tighten the net around Geary's finances, and prepare to bring the story into the light the moment the FBI moves. Perry opened his eyes from the armchair beside the fireplace, his sharp gaze cutting through the room, resting on his nephew's face for 1 second before he nodded, slowly, solemnly, like an old king handing the seal to his heir. Clean, Perry said, his voice slightly rough with age but clear. Your father would be proud. For the first 2 days at the Ashford farm, Celeste wasn't allowed to leave the bed. Not because anyone locked her in, but because Nettie Brandt wouldn't allow it. The 40-year-old nurse took Celeste's temperature every 4 hours, checked her frostbitten feet twice a day, and made her eat 6 small meals instead of 3 large ones, so her shrunken stomach could slowly learn to accept food again. Nettie didn't explain much. She only said it once, when Celeste tried to stand up on the afternoon of the first day. Your body has just gone through stage 2 hypothermia and 8 months of prolonged malnutrition. If you stand up now and pass out in the bathroom, hit your head on the sink, then everything everyone did for you last night becomes meaningless. Lie down. Celeste, lay down. Not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in 8 months, a woman was caring for her with firmness that wasn't meant to control her, but to keep her alive. But by the morning of the 3rd day, when Nettie took her temperature and nodded, saying, "You're stable now," Celeste got up, changed into the clean clothes Nettie had prepared, and went straight down to the oak-paneled study, where she knew Cormac would be because he was always there every morning. Cormac was sitting at the head of the table, a cup of black coffee in front of him, reading through a stack of papers Hollis had left behind. He looked up when he heard Celeste's footsteps at the door, and for an instant, he looked her over from head to toe, assessing quickly the way he assessed everything. The bruise around her eye had shifted from purple to yellow-green. Her steps were steadier, her back straighter, and in her eyes there was something that hadn't been there 2 days before. "I need to talk to you," Celeste said, standing at the threshold, not stepping in because 8 months of being controlled had taught her instinctively to wait until she was invited. Cormac nodded toward the chair across from him. Celeste sat down, placed both hands on the table, and said directly, "I want to contact Jolene. She's still in that basement. I can guide her on how to collect evidence from inside." Cormac set his coffee cup down on the table, looked at her with expressionless gray eyes, and answered with 2 words without needing to think. "Absolutely not." "You need evidence from inside," Celeste said, her voice calmer than she expected. "Ashworth said so in yesterday's meeting. I heard it. This study isn't soundproof." Cormac raised one eyebrow, a small movement, but enough for Hollis, who had just entered through the door behind Celeste, to realize that his boss had just been surprised, something that almost never happened. "You listened in on my meeting," Cormac said, not as a question. "I was lying in the room directly above this one," Celeste answered. "Old wooden floor. I didn't need to listen in. I just needed not to sleep." Cormac leaned back in his chair, both hands on the armrests, his eyes not leaving Celeste. "You have nothing to do with this part anymore, Celeste. You've told us what you know. From now on, This is Ashworth and the FBI's matter. You rest, recover, and when the time comes, you'll give your official statement in court. That's all." Celeste looked at Cormac. And then she did something Hollis Crane, who had stood beside Cormac Ashford for 15 years, had never seen anyone do. She stood, braced both hands on the oak tabletop, leaned forward, and looked straight into the face of the most powerful man within 100 miles, without blinking. "You have lawyers," Celeste said, her voice trembling slightly, but every word sharp as a blade. "You have the FBI. You have a whole army in black suits ready to appear in 30 minutes. But what does Jolene have, Cormac? She's 22. She's lying on a filthy mattress in that basement right now, right as you and I are sitting in this warm room drinking coffee. Every hour you sit here planning is one more hour she has to endure. And if you don't let me call her, I'll find my own way, even if I have to walk down to the foot of the hill in broad daylight." Hollis stood by the door, his eyebrows rising clearly. In 15 years, he had seen men holding guns who didn't dare look Cormac Ashford in the eye, and now a 27-year-old girl, weighing less than 110 pounds, was bracing her hands on the Ashford family conference table and telling his boss she would go on her own if he didn't. Agree. The room was silent. Cormac looked at Celeste. Not angry, not irritated. Something else moved through his gray eyes, fast and faint as a cloud shadow passing across a lake. Something Hollis recognized instantly because he had seen it exactly once before, many years ago, when Cormac first met a business opponent he truly respected. Acknowledgement. Cormac acknowledged that the woman standing before him wasn't a victim begging for help. She was an ally demanding the right to act. "Sit down," Cormac said, but this time his voice was different, not an order, almost an invitation. Celeste sat down, her back still straight, her eyes still not lowered. "Do you have a way to contact that girl?" Cormac asked. Celeste nodded. "Before I climbed through the ventilation window that night, I taught Jolene how to hide an old phone. No SIM card, only usable on Wi-Fi. I told her to tuck it inside the vent opening in the basement bathroom, where Geary never checks because he never goes down there unless he needs to punish someone. Geary's lodge has guest Wi-Fi. The signal is weak but strong enough to call through an encrypted app." Cormac looked at Hollis. Hollis gave a slight nod, confirming that technically the plan was possible. Cormac turned back to Celeste. "If Jolene is caught with that phone, you understand what will happen to her." "I understand," Celeste said, her voice no longer shaking. "And Jolene understands too. That's why I have to be the one who calls her, not the FBI, not a lawyer, not anyone else, because Jolene only trusts me." Cormac was silent for 3 seconds, then turned to Hollis. "Give her an encrypted phone." On the 4th night, at 11:45, the Ashford farmhouse kitchen lay in darkness, with only the light from the small lamp above the sink casting a faint yellow pool across the oak table. Celeste sat alone, her back straight, both elbows resting on the table, and in her hand was the encrypted phone Hollis had given her that afternoon. A black phone with no brand name, already installed with an end-to-end encrypted communication app that, according to Hollis, even the NSA would need 6 months to crack, and by then no one will need it cracked anymore. Celeste had already entered the Wi-Fi calling number for the old phone she had taught Jolene to hide inside the vent opening. Her finger rested on the call button, and she realized her finger was shaking. Not from cold. This kitchen was warm. She was shaking because she knew that, on the other end of the line, if Jolene picked up, she would hear the sound of the basement, the sound she had been trying to forget for the past 4 days, the buzz of fluorescent lights running 24 hours a day, the drip of water from a leaking pipe, the breathing of women trying to sleep on filthy mattresses. And she wasn't sure she was strong enough to hear those sounds again, without breaking into pieces. She pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. No one answered. The screen read, "Call ended." Celeste closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and called again. The first ring, the second. Then, in the middle of the 3rd ring, there was a soft click, and the other end opened into a world Celeste had left behind 4 nights earlier. The fluorescent hum, the dripping water, and Jolene's voice, whispering so faintly that Celeste had to press the phone close to her ear, broken, distorted from crying. "Miss Celeste? Are you still alive? Listen to me, Jolene. I'm safe. I'm somewhere safe. Listen to me. You have to stop calling." Jolene cut in, Her whisper panicked. "You don't know what happened after you left. Geary went crazy. He knows you escaped. Last night he moved 2 women, Rosa and Tim, in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, stuffed them into a cargo truck, and no one knows where they went. No one. They didn't even get to take anything. Miss Celeste, if he finds out I'm talking to you." Jolene's voice shattered into a silent sob, the kind of sob made by someone trying to cry without making sound, because the concrete walls were too thin. "Listen to me, Jolene," Celeste said, her voice calmer than she thought it could be, "because when someone else is afraid, you don't have the right to be afraid with them. I'm trying to get everyone out of there, but I need your help. The phone I taught you to hide, do you still have it? Can you record video inside the basement? Just—" "No," Jolene whispered, her voice almost pleading. "Please don't make me do anything. I can't. If he finds it, he'll lock me in the cold storage room, or worse, he'll move me like Rosa and Tum, and no one will ever find me again. Miss Celeste, please don't call back. Don't ever call back." The signal cut off. The screen went black. Celeste sat motionless on the wooden chair, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the steady beeping of the ended call. And she didn't lower her hand. She couldn't lower her hand. Because if she lowered her hand, that call would truly be over, and she would have to face the truth that she had just heard Jolene beg her to disappear, that 2 women had been moved in the night and no one knew where they were, and that she, Celeste Whitfield, the woman who had climbed through a ventilation window to find a way to save everyone, might not have saved anyone at all. She set the phone down on the table, stood up, grabbing the wool coat by the door. She walked out the back door, crossed the thin snow-covered yard beneath the cold moonlight, and went straight into the stable. The Black Arabian stood in the last stall, ears lifting at the sound of her footsteps, black eyes gleaming in the yellow light. Celeste sat down in the straw beside the stall, leaned her back against the wooden rail, pulled her knees to her chest, and cried. Not the quiet crying from the first night when she swallowed that spoonful of oatmeal. This time, she cried with her whole body, shoulders shaking, chest tightening, tears falling onto her knees, and she didn't try to hold it in because there was no reason left to hold anything in. The Black Arabian lowered its head over the stall rail, its warm muzzle touching her hair, hot breath brushing gently against the back of her neck, and it stood there, patient, silent, as if it understood that sometimes the only thing one living creature can do for another is not leave. Nettie found her 20 minutes later. The nurse stepped into the stable, saw Celeste curled in the straw, eyes swollen red, face soaked with tears. And Nettie didn't ask what had happened. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say, "Everything will be all right," because Nettie was a woman who never told lies. She only took the wool blanket hanging from the hook beside the stall door, sat down beside Celeste in the straw, pulled the blanket over both their shoulders, and stayed there. No talking, no questions, just there. And sometimes, saving others begins by accepting that you can't save them alone, that crying is part of the fight too, and that sitting in the straw in a stable at midnight, beside a woman who doesn't need you to be strong, is also a way not to collapse. The next morning, the 5th day, Celeste was sitting in the kitchen, eyes swollen, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, when the encrypted phone on the table vibrated. She looked at the screen. Jolene's number. Her hand shook as she answered. "Miss Celeste?" Jolene's voice came through, still whispering, still trembling. But there was something else in it now, something Celeste recognized instantly, because she had carried that same thing in her chest when she climbed through the ventilation window 4 nights earlier. The recklessness of someone with nothing left to lose. "I'm scared, but I'm more scared of staying." Celeste tightened her grip around the phone, tears sliding down her face, but her voice was steady. "Did you record anything yet?" "I recorded everything," Jolene said. "The basement, the mattresses, the lock on the refrigerator, everyone's faces. I'm sending it to you right now." Celeste closed her eyes, tears falling onto the oak table, and for the first time in 5 days, she felt the weight on her chest grow lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because she knew now that she was no longer fighting alone. On the afternoon of the 5th day, while Celeste was sitting with Hollis, converting Jolene's videos into a format Ashworth could submit to the FBI, Hollis's private phone vibrated. Hollis looked at the screen, raised one eyebrow, and stepped into the hallway. The call lasted no more than 3 minutes. When Hollis returned, his face hadn't changed, still cold, still sharp, still unreadable. but the way he set the phone down on the table was just a little heavier than usual, enough for Celeste to know something had happened. "Mercer just called," Hollis said, his voice as even as if he were reading a weather report, through the old channel. He passed along Geary's message. Cormac was standing by the study window, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out over the snow-covered pasture. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders stiffened slightly, a change so small only Hollis noticed. "Speak. Geary knows Celeste is here. Mercer told him right after the night he was driven away from the gate, but he isn't coming to demand her back again." Hollis stopped, choosing his words carefully, because what he was about to say next would change the board completely. "He's making threats. He says he has old transaction records between the Ashford family and Geary. Coal purchases through illegal channels. Money laundering. Records with signatures, account numbers, dates, from the time Uncle Perry was still running things." Cormac lowered the coffee cup onto the windowsill, slowly, without making a sound. Hollis continued. "Geary says if we don't return Celeste within 48 hours, he'll send the entire file to every newspaper in West Virginia. The Charleston Gazette-Mail, the Wheeling Intelligencer, all of them. And if that file comes to light, it won't be only Uncle Perry in trouble. The entire Ashford family will be under federal investigation." Celeste sat at the corner of the table, her hands still on the laptop keyboard, but her fingers had stopped typing. She looked at Cormac, then at Hollis, then back at Cormac, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't understood before. She wasn't only the person who had been saved, she had become the reason this family could collapse. "I'll leave," Celeste said, her voice small but clear, "if because of me." "Silence," Cormac said, still not turning around. But those two words carried enough weight to shut Celeste's mouth halfway through. He stood motionless by the window for another 10 seconds. 10 seconds in which Hollis knew he was rearranging the entire chessboard in his mind, recalculating every move, every consequence, every cost. Then he turned back, his gray eyes colder than at any moment since the night Celeste had crawled into the stable. "He just threatened my family," Cormac said, his voice low, slow, each word falling like stone. "That is the last mistake he'll ever make. Hollis, call Uncle Perry. Tell him to come up here. Right now." Perry Ashford arrived at the farm 40 minutes later, his cane tapping against the wooden floor of the hallway as he entered the oak-paneled study and sat down in the armchair beside the fireplace, his usual place. Cormac closed the door. Only the two of them remained inside. Hollis stood in the hallway. Knuckles guarded the stairs, and Celeste was on the second floor. The oak door was thick, but Celeste didn't need to hear to know what was happening inside. She knew because when the door opened 20 minutes later, Cormac's face carried an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not disappointment, but pain pressed down so tightly it had turned into stone, the kind of stone that would burn the hand of anyone who touched it. Cormac stepped into the hallway and looked at Hollis. "The coal transactions. Uncle Perry confirmed them. There was money laundering I didn't know about. 15 years. Hollis, he hid it from me for 15 years. Hollis didn't comment, didn't comfort him, didn't analyze, because that wasn't his job. His job was to wait for the next order. Cormac leaned back against the hallway wall, closed his eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them. His gray eyes had returned to normal, cold, sharp, focused. Whatever pain he had just felt had been locked away somewhere no one could reach, not even Cormac himself. Cormac turned back into the study. "The plan doesn't change," Cormac said, his voice dropping into a dark, calculating register. "But we don't let a rat hold a knife to our throats while we wait for the feds. Josiah, take 3 men tonight. Geary keeps those old records in his private safe at the lodge. I want that file out of his hands before dawn. He needs to think he still holds the leverage so he stays quiet and doesn't move the girls." Knuckles gave a single, grim nod and vanished down the hall. Perry was still sitting in the armchair, his cane laid across his thighs, his eyes fixed on the fire in the hearth. When he heard Cormac step inside, he looked up, and between the 2 men of the same blood, but 2 different generations of the same empire, there was a silence heavier than any words could fill. "Let that file come out if it must," Perry said, his voice rough but steady, his eyes fixed on his nephew. "I'm old, Cormac. I can take it. Prison, fines, losing land, losing face. I can take all of it. But those women can't take another night in there. If Josiah gets the file, we turn it over to the FBI ourselves. Don't let my past sins give that monster one more hour of freedom. Cormac nodded. A slow, heavy nod. And inside that nod was everything he didn't say aloud. The anger of being kept in the dark. The respect that couldn't be erased. The pain of knowing that after this, the Ashford family would never be the same again. And the acceptance that sometimes the price of justice isn't paid by the guilty, but carried by those standing beside them. A nod as heavy as a mountain. 3 days after the confrontation with Perry, every piece had fallen into place. Ashworth submitted the file to the FBI on the morning of the 6th day. Celeste Whitfield's official statement, 17 pages long, notarized, signed, fingerprinted, recording every detail of her 8 months in the basement of Geary's lodge, from the day she walked through that door to the night she climbed through the ventilation window. Attached to it were 4 videos Jolene had recorded on the old phone hidden in the vent opening. The windowless concrete basement. 7 filthy mattresses spread across the floor, the refrigerator locked with a chain, and the faces of 5 grown women looking into the camera with exhausted eyes. Hollis added the financial records he had gathered over the past 3 days. Unusual cash flow among Geary's 3 lodge properties, cash payments to Mercer recorded carelessly in double books, and a business license that had expired 2 years earlier without anyone in the county bothering to check. Crucially, the file now contained the blackmail ledger Knuckles had seamlessly retrieved from Geary's safe 2 nights prior. Geary, obese and arrogant, hadn't even checked his safe yet, entirely unaware that his ultimate insurance policy had already been handed over to a federal prosecutor. A federal judge in Charleston signed the search warrant on the afternoon of the 7th day. The FBI coordinated with the West Virginia State Police, bypassing entirely the county sheriff's office where Mercer served as sheriff. That was what Cormac wanted. He didn't say it to Ashworth in so many words, but Ashworth understood. The local law enforcement channel had been contaminated, and any information leaking through Mercer would give Geary time to destroy evidence or move the remaining women somewhere else, just as he had done with Rosa and Tem. The raid was set for 5:30 in the morning on the 9th day. On the night before the raid, the Ashford farm sank into a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence before a storm, the kind of silence in which the air itself seemed to thicken, and every tiny sound, the crack of old wood, the wind slipping through the seams of the doors, the horses stamping in the stable, sounded 10 times louder than usual. Celeste stood at the end of the second-floor hallway, in the same place where she had sat 4 nights earlier when Cormac brought her tea. But tonight she stood instead of sitting, both hands gripping the windowsill, her forehead nearly touching the cold glass as she looked down into the darkness below. The stable lights were still on, their warm yellow glow spilling over the snow, so familiar now that they had become something like a lighthouse in her life, the first light she had seen after 8 months of darkness, the light without which she would have frozen to death on the red dirt road, and no one in the world would have known she had ever existed. She heard Cormac's footsteps before she saw him, not because he walked softly this time, but because she had begun to know the rhythm of his steps. Long, even, moderately heavy, the footsteps of a man who always knew where he was going. He stopped beside her, bringing no tea this time, both hands tucked into his pants pockets as he looked in the same direction. "Are you sure Jolene will be safe?" Celeste asked, her voice small, not looking at him. Cormac didn't answer right away. He wasn't the kind of man who made promises just to make someone feel better, and Celeste had been here long enough to know that. When he spoke, his voice was direct, unadorned. "Tomorrow morning you'll have your answer. Not from me. From reality." Celeste nodded, accepting that answer because it was honest, and after 8 months of living with Geary's lies, honesty was a luxury she valued more than any comfort. She looked out toward the stable, where the yellow light still trembled faintly in the wind, and asked a question she had held inside for the past 8 days but had never dared speak, because she feared the answer. If I hadn't crawled into the stable that night, what would have happened to the women in the basement? Cormac was silent. Not because he didn't know the answer. He knew it clearly, more clearly than anyone. If Celeste hadn't crawled through the white wooden fence that night, Geary would have continued. Mercer would have continued taking $500. The basement would have continued swallowing people, and Cormac Ashford would have continued sitting in his farm on top of the hill, drinking black coffee every morning, looking out over the snow-covered fields, and knowing nothing, or worse, not bothering to ask. The FBI had had an open file for 6 months, but no witness. Ashworth had a hotline, but no reason to pick it up. 30 men were ready to stand in a snowstorm, but no one had told them to rise. A whole enormous machine. Lawyers, the FBI, family, money, power. All of it existed. All of it was ready. And all of it stood motionless. Until a 27-year-old woman in a soaked housekeeping uniform, wearing torn plastic slippers, crawled through a fence into a stable and whispered a request to sleep there for the night. Sometimes, an entire machine of justice begins only because one person is desperate enough to knock on the door no one else dares to touch. Cormac said nothing. He only looked out at the stable for a long while longer, then turned on his heel and walked toward his room. And before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, he stopped, without turning back. Rest, Celeste. Morning comes early. At 5:15 in the morning on the 9th day, the snowstorm stopped completely for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Blackthorn Hollow lay beneath a layer of white snow, so thick the entire town looked as though it had been erased from the map. Not a footprint, not a tire mark, not a single thread of smoke from any chimney, because it was still too early, and no one in that dead town woke before 6 o'clock in winter. No one except those who hadn't slept. Celeste had been standing at the second-floor window of the Ashford farm since 4 o'clock in the morning, looking down toward the highway at the foot of the hill, where Geary's lodge sat motionless in the dark like a sleeping beast. The roof of the 3-story lodge covered in white snow, the parking lot empty, the sign lights dead, and somewhere beneath the concrete of the basement, 5 women and Jolene were waiting for a morning they didn't know would come. At 5:25, Celeste saw them. From the east, on the highway, 4 black SUVs appeared at the same time, headlights off, only their marker lights blinking faintly, gliding over the snow-covered road like 4 shadows moving in silence. There were no badges on the bodies of the vehicles, no lettering of any kind, but the way they moved, close together, at the same speed, exact down to every meter, showed they weren't civilian cars. At the same moment, from the west, 2 West Virginia State Police cruisers came rushing in, red and blue lights flashing but no sirens, their white and blue paint standing out against the snow. The 6 vehicles converged in the parking lot of Geary's lodge in less than 30 seconds, stopping in a formation that blocked every entrance and exit, and the doors flew open together. FBI agents in black jackets, with FBI printed in white across their backs, jumped out, handguns already drawn but pointed toward the ground, moving toward the front and back doors of the lodge in 2 groups. State police stood blocking the parking lot, hands on their weapon belts, eyes scanning the area. And on the other side of the highway, exactly 200 meters from Geary's lodge, another line of black vehicles stood silently along the roadside. The Ashford family convoy, not interfering, not approaching, only standing there, like a steel fence in the snow, bearing witness. Cormac Ashford leaned against the first black Escalade in the line, a cup of hot coffee in his right hand, the steam rising into the skin, cutting cold and curling around his fingers like smoke. He wasn't wearing a suit, but his heavy wool coat was buttoned tight against the bitter wind, his collar turned up to shield him from the 20-degree air. He looked across the road, where the raid was unfolding, with the calm gray eyes of a man who had placed every piece in the right position and now only needed to watch the board play itself. The sound of pounding on the door echoed across the snow. FBI, open the door. Federal search warrant. No one opened. A second round of pounding. No one opened. The third sound wasn't a knock, but steel striking wood, the lock bursting, and the front door of Geary's lodge flying open. Agents poured inside, the sound of heavy boots on rotten wooden stairs ringing through the quiet morning, shouts of FBI echoing from one floor to the next. Ground floor, clear. Second floor, guest rooms empty. Third floor, manager's office, door closed. The agents broke the latch, and inside, Randall Geary was sitting on the bed in wrinkled pajamas, eyes wide, face flushed red, still holding the phone he had used to call Mercer 30 seconds earlier, but no one had answered. When 2 agents seized him from both sides and pulled him to his feet, Geary began screaming, "This is my private property. Those people are contract employees. I have legal labor contracts. You have no right." No one bothered to listen, because in the basement, the 3rd agent had already found the steel door locked from the outside, broken the latch, and stepped down the concrete stairs. What they saw below matched every frame in Jolene's video exactly. 7 filthy mattresses spread across the concrete floor, fluorescent lights blazing white 24 hours a day, no windows, no ventilation except one small opening in the ceiling, a refrigerator locked with a chain, and 6 grown women huddled on the mattresses, blinking again and again beneath the agent's flashlights, unable to believe what was happening. Jolene sat in the farthest corner, her back against the concrete wall, both arms wrapped around her knees, and when she lifted her head and saw the letters FBI on the jacket of the first agent coming down the stairs, she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't stand. She only closed her eyes, bit down hard on her lower lip, and nodded. One tiny, exhausted nod, as if she were telling herself that Miss Celeste's promise had been real, that someone had heard, that the basement door had finally opened from the outside. In the safe in the 3rd-floor office, agents found 7 sets of identification papers, 7 identification cards, 7 driver's licenses, 7 social security cards, neatly arranged inside 7 brown envelopes, each envelope marked with a woman's name in black ink, Randall Geary's handwriting clean and orderly, as if he were storing inventory instead of human lives. Geary was dragged out of the lodge in his pajamas, barefoot in the cold snow, hands cuffed behind his back, still shouting about contracts, ownership, lawyers, until the agents led him across the parking lot, and Geary looked to the other side of the highway, where the Ashford family's black vehicles lined the roadside in absolute silence, and at the head of that line, Cormac Ashford stood leaning against the Escalade, coffee cup in hand, looking straight into his eyes. Geary shut his mouth. For the first time in 58 years, Randall Geary was completely silent. 15 minutes before the FBI broke down the door of Geary's lodge, while the federal convoy was still gliding along the highway in the dark, Randall Geary had picked up the phone and called Dale Mercer. The call came at 5:15 in the morning, the phone ringing 7 times before Mercer answered, his voice heavy with sleep, irritated, and completely unprepared for what he was about to hear. "There are strange vehicles on the highway," Geary whispered over the phone, his voice trembling, his breathing heavy. "A lot of vehicles, lights off, heading toward the lodge. Dale, you have to get here right now. Right now." Mercer sat up in bed, switched on the lamp on his nightstand, and over the next 30 seconds, he made the stupidest decision of his 30-year career. He got dressed, put on his sheriff's hat, buckled on his weapon belt, jumped into his patrol car, and drove straight to Geary's lodge. He didn't call his deputies. He didn't call dispatch. He didn't check whether any law enforcement operation was happening in his jurisdiction, something he, as county sheriff, should have been notified about. He didn't check because he didn't think he needed to. In Mercer's mind, Geary's lodge was his territory, the place where he collected $500 each time he dragged a girl back, the steady side income that had fed his football betting habit for the past 10 years. Anyone who came to Geary's lodge without going through him was an intruder, and he would deal with that intruder using the badge and the authority of sheriff he had used like a shield to cover every dirty thing for 2 decades. Mercer's patrol car shot down the highway at 5:32, exactly 2 minutes after the FBI breached the lodge's front door. He saw the red and blue lights from a distance, but they weren't the lights of his car. They were the lights of 2 West Virginia State Police cruisers blocking the parking lot. Then he saw 4 unmarked black SUVs, and the white FBI lettering printed across the backs of the jackets worn by the men moving in and out of the lodge. Mercer slammed on the brakes. The patrol car's tires screamed against the snow-covered road, sliding nearly 5 meters before coming to a full stop, right inside the perimeter, right in the middle of the Geary's Lodge parking lot, right in the middle of the trap he had driven himself into. He looked left. Black FBI SUVs, agents in jackets with federal markings, handguns holstered. He looked right. State police vehicles, officers in gray-blue uniforms, their eyes fixed on his county patrol car with the stare colleagues reserve for a colleague who has betrayed them. And straight ahead, across the highway, the Ashford family's line of black vehicles stood silently along the roadside. And at the head of that line, Cormac Ashford stood beside the Escalade, both hands in his coat pockets, holding nothing, saying nothing, only watching. Mercer hadn't even managed to turn off the engine when an FBI agent stepped to the driver's side door, tapped the glass with the back of his hand, and when Mercer lowered the window, the cold wind rushed in along with a voice calm, professional, and colder than the temperature outside. "Sheriff Dale Mercer. I'm Special Agent Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Charleston Field Office. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and accessory to forced labor. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to have an attorney present during questioning. Please step out of the vehicle." Mercer didn't move. His hands were still clenched around the steering wheel, his eyes staring straight through the windshield. His jaw tightened so hard the tendons at his temples twitched beneath the brim of his sheriff's hat. He was trying to process the information, but his mind, a mind used to operating in a world where the badge was an all-purpose shield, couldn't process a reality in which that very badge had become evidence against him. "Step out of the vehicle, Sheriff," Agent Morrison repeated. This time his voice half a tone lower but twice as heavy. Mercer opened the door, stepped down into the snow, and in the moment he stood upright in the middle of the Geary's Lodge parking lot. The first dawn light of the 9th day slipped through the eastern mountain gap and fell directly across his face. And in that pale gold light, Franklin Ashworth walked toward him from behind the federal SUV, 50 years old, wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit without a single wrinkle, despite the -3-degree air, gold-rimmed glasses glinting in the early sun, and on his lips a small, polite smile, the kind of smile a lawyer gives an opponent when the game ended 10 moves ago, but the opponent has only just realized it. Ashworth took a business card from the inner pocket of his suit jacket, stepped beside Mercer, and gently slipped it into the breast pocket of the man's patrol shirt, patting it twice. "If you need a defense attorney, Sheriff," Ashworth said, his voice soft as if they were speaking at a cocktail party, "don't call me." 2 agents turned Mercer around and cuffed his hands behind his back. A state police officer stepped forward and removed the sheriff's badge from Mercer's chest with one clean, precise jerk, not one movement wasted. The badge slipped from the officer's hand, or perhaps he let it fall on purpose, landing face up on the white snow, lying there for 1 second beneath the dawn light, the gold metal flashing one final time before sinking slowly into the soft snow, disappearing as though Blackthorn Hollow were taking back something it should never have given Dale Mercer in the first place. Mercer was pushed into the back seat of the federal SUV. Before the door closed, his eyes moved past Ashworth, past the agents, past the state police officer, searching among the convoy across the highway until they found Cormac Ashford. Cormac stood beside the vehicle, both hands still in his pockets, the morning wind stirring the hem of his wool coat. He said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He only stood there, and in those gray eyes, Mercer saw something worse than anger or contempt. Indifference. Cormac Ashford watched Dale Mercer being handcuffed and placed into a federal vehicle, with the same expression he might give a pothole in the road that someone would fill tomorrow. The door closed. Mercer vanished behind the dark glass, and on the white snow of the Geary's Lodge parking lot, the sheriff's badge remained, sinking deeper and deeper, until no one could see it anymore. The week after the raid, Blackthorn Hollow was no longer a town the whole country had forgotten. The 7 grown women rescued through the operation, including those from the basement of Geary's Lodge, were placed in the Federal Trafficking Victim Protection Program on the very first day. Ambulances, social workers, and public defenders poured into the tiny town in the middle of the Appalachian Range, as if someone had finally lifted the lid off a box the entire system had deliberately been sitting on for years. Randall Geary was indicted on 14 federal counts: forced labor, human trafficking, unlawful confiscation of identification documents, contract fraud, tax evasion, and 9 other charges, each of them enough to put him in federal prison for at least 5 years. In total, Geary faced 30 years behind bars. The court-appointed defense attorney assigned to him asked for a reduced sentence on the grounds that he was a misguided businessman, but the federal judge rejected the request in less than 10 minutes. Dale Mercer was permanently stripped of his badge, stripped of his right to carry a weapon, and held in federal custody while awaiting trial. For 30 years, he had used that badge as a shield, and now that shield lay beneath the snow in the parking lot of the lodge he had once protected. But the real aftershock came when the FBI expanded the investigation. The financial records Hollis had gathered on Geary, combined with the banking data the FBI extracted from his accounts, showed that Geary's Lodge in Blackthorn Hollow wasn't the only property. 2 other lodges, one in Mingo County and one in Logan County, operated under the exact same model. Recruitment flyers, room and board included, confiscated documents, women locked in basements, forced labor. The FBI raided both locations within 48 hours of the Blackthorn Hollow operation. In total, 19 captive women were rescued, 19 lives locked in darkness by the same fat, cologne-soaked hand. The news exploded. The Charleston Gazette-Mail ran a 4-part front-page investigation. The Washington Post covered it. CNN aired a report. The name Blackthorn Hollow, a town even Google Maps had to be zoomed in 3 times to find, suddenly appeared on every national news broadcast. And in the middle of that media storm, Perry Ashford did something no one had asked him to do. He went voluntarily to the FBI field office in Charleston, sat down at the interview table, and disclosed every money laundering transaction between himself and Geary from 15 years earlier. He didn't wait to be investigated, didn't wait to be subpoenaed, didn't bring a lawyer. He sat there for 4 hours, recounting every transaction, every account number, every figure, in the flat, hoarse voice of an old man who had decided this would be the last time he carried a secret on his back. The consequences came immediately: a federal fine. And to pay that fine, Perry had to sell 80 acres of land on the south side of the Ashford farm, the land Cormac's grandfather had bought back in the immigrant days, the land with the old stable, the summer pasture, and the white wooden fence 3 generations of Ashfords had repainted every spring. On the morning the moving trucks left the sold portion of the land, Cormac stood at the northern fence, looking down. He said nothing. His jaw was clenched, his gray eyes following the last truck until it disappeared around the bend, and on his face there was no expression except the silence of a man swallowing something very bitter that he wasn't allowed to spit out. Perry stood beside his nephew, his cane planted on the frozen ground, his silver hair blowing in the cold wind. He placed his thin, age-spotted hand on Cormac's shoulder and said the only sentence he would ever say about it, then and forever. "Land can be bought back, Cormac. A conscience can't." Cormac didn't turn to look at his uncle. He only nodded, faintly, then walked along the fence toward the main house, alone, his back straight, his strides long, the same as every day. But Hollis, standing 20 meters away, noticed that his boss's steps were heavier than usual today, heavier by exactly 80 acres. 3 weeks after the raid, the federal trial opened in Charleston. Celeste Whitfield walked into the courtroom wearing the gray suit Nettie had bought for her copper-brown hair combed neatly, her back straight, her gray-blue eyes fixed ahead. She took the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and began to tell the story. 8 months. The basement, the filthy mattresses, the refrigerator locked with a chain, 16 hours a day, Geary, Mercer, $500, the flyer on the laundromat door. Her voice shook, especially when she reached the part about hiding food for Jolene and Geary finding out, but she didn't stop. Not once. The 12 members of the jury sat as still as statues, and one female juror in the front row quietly wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, without ever taking her gaze off Celeste. When Celeste stepped out of the courtroom, the courthouse hallway was empty, with only the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall glass windows, and at the end of the hallway, leaning back against the stone wall, Jolene was waiting, 22 years old. Her hair shorter than the last time Celeste had seen her, thinner now but standing straight, her eyes no longer terrified but wet. And when Celeste came closer, Jolene said nothing. Celeste said nothing either. There was no need. The 2 women embraced in the middle of the federal courthouse hallway, holding each other so tightly that both their shoulders shook, and inside that embrace was everything language could never touch: the fear that had passed, the promise that had been kept, and the small miracle that both of them were still standing here, still breathing, still alive, after everything. 3 months later, spring came to Blackthorn Hollow like a late apology from the weather. The snow melted, the red dirt roads emerged beneath the first warm sunlight since November, and on the hills surrounding the town, young grass pushed through the damp soil, green, fragile, and so resilient it was almost stubborn, as if the earth were proving that everything buried long enough would eventually find a way to rise. Celeste Whitfield lived in the small caretaker's cottage on the west corner of the Ashford farm, a 1-story wooden house that Knuckles and 2 workers had repaired in 10 days. A new roof, new floors, a working fireplace, windows facing the stable, and a front door with no lock on the outside. A detail Nettie had specifically told the workers to pay attention to. Nettie came every day during the first week, checking Celeste's health, making sure she ate enough meals, slept enough, and showed no severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress that required specialized intervention. By the second week, Nettie came every other day. By the first month, she only stopped by for afternoon tea and talked about the most ordinary things in the world: the weather, recipes, which flowers grew well in Appalachian soil, because Nettie understood that the most important part of healing wasn't medicine or therapy, but learning how to live an ordinary day again without fear. Every morning, when dawn had just touched the crest of the hill, Celeste stepped out of the little house and walked straight down to the stable. She cared for the Ashford Farms horses, feeding them, changing the straw, checking their hooves, grooming them, leading them out to pasture, and each of those tasks became a small brick, rebuilding her from the foundation up. Especially the Black Arabian, the horse she had seen first on the night she crawled into the stable. The horse that had lowered its head and breathed warmth into her hair on the night she cried in the straw. The horse that had stood quietly beside her while the whole world swayed. She named him Midnight. And every morning when she stood beside him with the grooming brush in her hand was steady, not shaking, and her voice gently commanded him to walk, turn, and stand still, with the kind of voice that 3 months earlier had known only how to whisper a plea for a place to sleep. In the evenings, after the stable work was done, Celeste sat at the small table in her house, opened the laptop Hollis had bought for her, and studied. She enrolled in an online degree completion program at West Virginia University, majoring in social work. Every night, she read her textbooks until her eyes could barely stay open, underlining, taking notes, writing essays, and in every page she read, she saw the faces of the women in the basement, saw the terrified eyes of Jolene on her first day, saw herself standing in front of the flyer in the laundromat, and she knew exactly who she was studying to become. The person in between, the person who stopped the door before it slammed shut, so no one would ever have to crawl through a stranger's fence at 3 o'clock in the morning simply because there was nowhere else in the world to go. One spring afternoon, when golden sunlight scattered across the green pasture on the north side of the farm, a small car drove up the hill road and stopped in front of the stable. Jolene stepped out, 22 years old, her hair cut short to her shoulders, her face fuller than the last time Celeste had seen her in the courthouse hallway, her eyes no longer terrified, though still carrying something only people who had passed through darkness could recognize in one another. Celeste was leading Midnight through the pasture. She saw Jolene standing by the fence, and both of them stopped, looking at each other across the green field, across 20 yards of new grass, across everything they had survived together. Then Celeste let go of the reins, and Jolene climbed over the fence, and they walked toward each other, faster, then faster, until they met in the middle of the pasture and embraced, crying and laughing at the same time, the kind of crying and laughing only people who once thought they would never see each other again could understand, while the spring wind moved through their hair, carrying the scent of young grass, damp earth, and a world beginning again. That afternoon, after Jolene had driven away, Hollis stood beside Cormac by the white wooden fence, the two men looking out over the field where Celeste was leading Midnight through the late afternoon sun, her shadow and the horse's shadow stretching long over the green grass, slow, peaceful, as if the world had never been cruel. Hollis tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat, looked over at Cormac, and asked in the rare gentle voice he only used when no one else was around, "What are you going to say to her?" Cormac looked out over the field, his gray eyes softer than Hollis had ever seen in 15 years of standing beside him, and answered in a low, calm voice, without a single ripple. "Nothing needs to be said, Hollis. She's free now. That's enough." Silence. The spring wind moved across the pasture, gently stirring the white wooden fence, and far out in the field, Celeste Whitfield led the black horse toward the sunset, her steps steady, her back straight, her head held high, the silhouette of a woman who was no longer running away. 6 months later, autumn, the Appalachian hills burned in shades of red, orange, and gold, maple and oak forests, stretching all the way to the horizon like a painting nature created only once a year, then erased with winter. The stable at the Ashford farm stood wide open to the afternoon sun, that honey gold light particular to October, warm enough to touch the skin, but not warm enough to let anyone forget that winter was coming. The scent of freshly cut hay mingled with the smell of baked apples drifting from the large kitchen, where Nettie was baking for Sunday dinner, a scent that 9 months earlier Celeste Whitfield wouldn't have dared dream she would ever smell again in her life. Celeste stood in the last stall beside the Black Arabian, her right hand holding a grooming brush, her left hand resting on the horse's neck, and she was no longer the woman who had crawled through this doorway 9 months before. She had gained nearly 20 pounds, her body no longer gaunt and skeletal but strong from daily stable work, her copper-brown hair glossy and tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her gray-blue eyes clear and free of bruises, and the hand holding the brush was calloused across the palm from 9 months of holding reins, carrying straw, and shoeing horses. calluses she was prouder of than anything she had ever owned. On the stable windowsill, beside a cold cup of coffee, lay a social work textbook. Its spine cracked from being read too many times. Its pages dog-eared and marked in blue ballpoint ink, with notes in the margins written in the small but clear handwriting of a woman who was studying not just to pass exams, but so that one day she could stand among people like herself and say, "I understand because I've been there." Footsteps sounded on the stone path covered with maple leaves. Celeste looked up. Cormac Ashford stepped into the stable, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw another version of him. No black suit, no convoy, no Hollis on his right, no Knuckles on his left. Just a 33-year-old man in a gray flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, old leather boots muddy from the ground, black hair slightly tousled by the autumn wind, and in his hand, a small dark brown leather box, no larger than his palm. He stopped beside the stall, gave the black Arabian a light pat on the neck, then opened the box in front of Celeste. Inside, on black velvet, lay a plastic card. Celeste looked down. The card bore her name, Celeste Whitfield, and beneath it were the words, West Virginia University, and beside them were two words she had to read twice before she could believe they were real: full scholarship. The Ashford Family Charitable Foundation, completely legal, through Ashworth. "Go to school, Whitfield," Cormac said, his voice even, not ceremonial, not emotional, not performed, just the voice of a man stating a simple fact. "Come back here whenever you want. The stable is always open." Celeste held the card, heavier than any card she had ever held, not because of the plastic, but because of what it meant. She looked around the stable, at the afternoon sunlight pouring through the wide-open wooden doors, the golden straw on the floor, the black Arabian standing still beside her, and she saw all of it at once. This door, this frozen ground, this place where 9 months earlier she had crawled in on both knees in the middle of a snowstorm, her face bruised, her feet in torn plastic slippers, begging a stranger to let her sleep there until morning, the place where her life had split in two, before and after. Celeste set the grooming brush on the windowsill beside the textbook, slipped the card into her pants pocket, and stepped out of the stable. The autumn sun settled over her face, soft and warm, and she walked along the stone path with her back straight, shoulders open, her steps steady on ground she no longer feared. For the first time in 27 years, Celeste Whitfield wasn't walking because she was running away. She was walking because she had somewhere to return to. Celeste's story reminds us that human dignity doesn't depend on circumstance, that courage sometimes isn't standing tall, but crawling toward the light when the whole world wants to keep you in darkness, and that justice sometimes comes from the places no one expects, not because that place is perfect, but because someone there chooses not to turn away. Forced labor and human trafficking don't exist only somewhere far away on a map. They exist right inside small towns, behind locked doors, and the only way they end is when we choose not to stay silent. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Press like to support us in continuing to tell the stories that need to be told, and share this video with a friend, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way someone sees the world. How did this story make you feel? Which moment touched you the most? Please write it in the comments below. We read every line, and we'd truly love to hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Thank you for staying until the very end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in your heart every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.